Hello, Knox County students. I'm Rachel Mashburn, and I teach English at Central High School. Go Bobcats! Welcome to KCS at Home Summer Edition. Today's lesson is based on Task 4 for English 4. If you do not have this assignment, it can be found by visiting the KCS website at knoxschools.org. Please click See All Resources under the KCS at Home logo. Today's lesson will focus on identifying and using narrative techniques, developing plot, characterization, and theme by using vivid descriptions to sequence events and create descriptions of characters, setting, and events, understanding how all these elements combine create the tone and theme a writer needs to convey to entertain and/or edify the reader. Creating a short story that shares observations about life that draw on your personal experience, your imagination, and hopefully both. Activities to accomplish our objectives for this lesson are: review the elements of plot, point of view, and characterization. Annotate The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin by noting the elements of plot, the point of view, and the characterization seen in the story. Read the prompt and plan the framework of your short story using the two graphic organizers provided. Draft your short story. Complete writer craft practice using sentence types for effect. And revise your short story. Materials to accomplish our objective for this lesson are The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin, the plot diagram organizer for note-taking, the characterization graphic organizer for note-taking, and two that I suggest would be a reference sheet that reviews literary devices and strategies, and a reference sheet for writing dialogue. Activity 1. Review the elements of plot, point of view, and characterization. Exposition is the first element of plot that we encounter. That's when we see the main character or characters have a conflict, and we also see the basic setting. And then as the protagonist has problems, the events leading up to facing this conflict or problem start to unfold, making the story more complicated and interesting. This is, of course, rising action. And then the climax. The major event occurs in which the main character faces the source of the conflict. It's a very big deal. Tying up the loose ends by sometimes ironing out how characters deal with the repercussions of the climax. And then the resolution is how the story ends. Now let's review characterization and point of view. Let's talk a little bit more in-depthly about point of view, because you're going to have to choose what point of view perspective you are going to write your story from. First person. Are you going to use the protagonist to tell the story? There's some benefits to that, but please keep in mind that the reader will know nothing about the characters or events that the narrator hasn't experienced firsthand. Third person point of view. The indicators there is the he, she, it pronoun usage, but it's used when a narrator is not a character in the story most of the time. Third person limited. This means a narrator only knows what the character knows, what they themselves as the narrator know. And then third person omniscient. That's where the narrator knows everything about everyone and will choose to expose or detail those or not. Let's talk about the characterization elements, because these are things that you're going to want to sit down and think about when you're fleshing out your main character. It's kind of like how you choose your friends. Just a little bit, isn't it? We choose our friends by their actions, hopefully not their physical characteristics, but we do judge people by that. what the character says, what other people say about them, maybe their thoughts and feelings. If you're reading a story narrated by third person limited or third person omniscient, you'll know the thoughts and feelings of that person. You can judge them by those. Other details, such as character motivation. What are they really motivated by? Does that tell you something about the character? Does that make that character more real? What we want to steer away from are stereotypical characters. Activity 2. Hopefully you have read The Story of an Hour, but there's nothing like rereading The Story of an Hour to pick up on all the elements you need and to review to write your own short story. Knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. So right away, Kate Chopin has given us the main character and the conflict. It was her sister Josephine who told her in broken sentences, veiled hints that revealed and half concealing her husband's friend Richards was there too, near her. It was he who had been in the newspaper office when intelligence of the railroad disaster was received, with Brentley Mallard's name leading the list of killed. He had only taken the time to assure himself of its truth by a second telegram, and had hastened to forestall any less careful, less tender friend in bearing the sad message. She did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept at once with sudden wild abandonment in her sister's arms. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her. Now, the exposition. We see that Mrs. Mallard's husband has been killed in a railroad accident, but that Mrs. Mallard has a heart condition. It tells us right here, afflicted with a heart trouble. So Josephine, her sister, and Richards, her husband's friend, need to break this news to her as gingerly as possible because they're frightened that the news could possibly kill her. Rising action. One of the first events there, or a piece of information, is that Richards and Josephine gently break the news that Brentley's been killed. So, and Mrs. Mallard's first reaction was to go to her bedroom alone. There stood facing the open window a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all a-quiver with the new spring life, all the tones taking a different direction. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. The street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. The mood certainly seems to be more light-hearted than the previous page. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. She sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came up in her throat and shook her as a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. She was young, with a fair, calm face, whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes, whose gaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. It was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. There was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it, fearfully. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name, but she felt it creeping out of the sky, reaching toward her through the sounds, the scents, the colors that filled the air. So much imagery on this page. Kate Chopin uses so much imagery to actually control the mood of this scene, where Louise Mallard is sat in her room alone after hearing about the death of her husband. Let's review some rising action. Of course, we know that Richards and Josephine broke the news to her, and that she goes alone to her room. But here in the second paragraph of this page, Louise begins to notice everything happening outside her home. And those things that she notices are very picturesque and pleasant. Kate Chopin paints them with lovely words: a quiver with new spring life, delicious breath, peddlers crying as wares, a distant song. Oh, my stars, it's all so lovely, isn't it? Louise and then suddenly becomes frightened because of this creeping feeling that comes over her. And that's after the description, so she knows something is foreboding. Characterization. Kate Chopin was very careful to tell us that Louise Mallard is a young, fair, calm-faced, if not repressed, young woman. That tells us a little bit about her characterization. Now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her, and she was striving to beat it back with her will. As powerless as her two white, slender hands would have been, when she abandoned herself, a little whisper word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under her breath. Free, free. The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes. They stayed keen and bright. Her pulse beat fast, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. She didn't stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her. A clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. She knew she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed and gray and dead. But she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely, and she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. There would be no one to live for during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. And yet she loved him sometimes. Often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession of self-worth, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her body? Free, body and soul, free, she kept whispering. Louise begins to experience this newfound freedom, and it gives her a new lease on life. They're very careful to paint Brentley as a kind, loving husband, or Kate Chopin is very careful to do that. But that she feels repressed by marriage in general. So maybe Kate Chopin is making a statement, an observation about life. Josephine was kneeling before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. Louise, open the door, I beg. Open the door. You'll make yourself ill. What are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sakes, open the door. Go away. I'm not making myself ill. No, she was drinking in a very elixir of life through that open window. Her fancy was running right along those days ahead of her, spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be hers and hers alone. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday that she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. She arose at length and opened the door to her sister's inopportunities. There was a feverish triumph in her eyes, and she carried herself unwittingly like a goddess of victory. She clasped her sister's waist, and together they descended the stairs. Richard stood waiting for them at the bottom. Someone was opening the front door with a latchkey. It was Brentley Mallard who entered, a little travel-stained, composedly carrying his gripsack and umbrella. He had been far from the scene of the accident and didn't even know there'd been one. He stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry, at Richard's quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of a joy that kills. We see that Josephine will not allow her sister to mourn alone because she's afraid that this will kill her sister, so she begs her to come out. She's lived a very sheltered life because of this condition that she has. While she's there in that room, she's looking forward to an unmarried future. And she even tells us that she hopes she lives a long time, or she was dreading the fact that life might be long. The climax of the story is when she opens that door and leaves the room a free woman. She feels like she's a goddess of victory. But when she descends, I got frightened by that lightning. When she descends the stairs, her view is blocked by Richards, and she suddenly sees what she thought to be her dead husband, and she dropped dead right there on the stairs. Now, we know because we were allowed to know. The narrator told us that Louise was very happy about being free, about her husband no longer being alive. She was pleased with that, but no one else was privy to what we were told by the narrator in that little room. The irony is, the resolution is that she dies when she sees her husband. That's the ending event. But Kate Chopin uses irony here as a plot twist, and it's a very effective one. She's looking forward to a long life, and she dies. It's like that song, Isn't It Ironic? Activity 3. Read the writing prompt and plan the framework of your story using the 2 graphic organizers provided. Write a short story that meets the requirements listed in the learning targets and the scoring guide, which you have. Be sure to include a well-structured, well-paced sequence of events. How many events are you going to have in your story? What's the climax going to be? Who are the characters going to be? What's the conflict? What does the setting look like? Build the conflict, climax, and resolution to support the theme. Include descriptive sensory details to enhance the mood and tone of your story, and use a range of literary strategies and devices to strengthen your writing. And use simple, periodic, or loose sentences to achieve specific effects. Loose sentences really help establish the mood, and periodic sentences are very good for creating suspense. You might consider developing a story similar to The Story of an Hour, or you might create something completely original. As you pre-write, Make and use new copies of the graphic organizer for developing plot and characterization, or make your own style of organizer. Just include all those elements. The first step of pre-writing, you're going to really want to generate some content. You don't know what your story is going to be about yet, right? So you might want to engage in some brainstorming. Brainstorm ideas that you might want to write about. It might be a personal experience that you've had in your life. And then take some more pre-writing notes on a characterization. And certainly think about what point of view you're going to use to write your story. Create a setting graphic organizer if you choose to, and plan how you're going to use the sensory detail to make the setting more believable. For example, if I were writing a story about an oceanographer, the setting could not be in the hills of East Tennessee, right? Probably not. That probably wouldn't make a lot of sense. It's not really realistic. If I were going to make a story about Count Dracula, would I have the setting on Waikiki Beach? Probably no. You've got to make sure it's realistic. When you create your setting, think about this. Think about delicate little details that you can give away that would set your reader down in that time frame, in that setting. You don't have to come right out and say, this story took place in Massachusetts in 1641. Give some details. Give some sensory details, some little descriptions of things that might have been present during the time that you're writing your story. I always think about season when you're thinking about setting, time, and place. Paint a pretty picture. And make sure as you do that, as you describe your major character, as you describe your setting, and then you go on to describe your major characters, make sure that you use vivid language to do that. And step 6, make sure that you contemplate what your theme might be, what message or theme you would like to portray to your audience. Remember, a good writer leaves a reader better than he or she found them. Yeah. You've broadened their experiences. How wonderful it is that we can relive history sometimes through the eyes of characters painted by brilliant writers. Isn't that exciting? Activity 4. This is when we begin drafting our short story. We're going to use our plot framework and our pre-writing. As we draft our stories, here's what we need to think about. We really need to think about our dialogue, because a short story isn't a short story without dialogue. It's just a reflective essay of a narrative nature. So we must have dialogue, and that's why I put in the material list that you may want to use a reference for writing dialogue, a little cheat sheet, if you will. How much dialogue do you need? Play around with it a little bit. Sometimes less is more, but what important thing would they be saying to move the plot? What things could you have a character say to move the plot along that would be easier and less words to have it said than to paint the picture out in paragraphs? And think about these things. Hopefully you've taken some time to write your draft. I wish I could read them. Sounds very exciting. I can't wait to see what sort of ideas get generated from this. That's pretty exciting to me. After you write your first draft, you need some distance from that first draft. Just a little bit of distance. You need to look away so that you can look at it with fresh eyes. So while you're looking away, we're going to switch gears and look at something else. Come on, let's go. We're going to complete the writer's craft practice using sentence types for effect. First, we review sentence types mainly We're going to review simple and complex sentences, independent clauses, uh, complete sentences. Here's an example from the story. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. What a beautiful, simple sentence. And it's a lovely way to directly make a statement. But you don't want to write a series of simple sentences, otherwise your tone is going to appear quite childish, and it will, most importantly, bore your reader. And remember what your goal is as a writer. Your goal is to entertain. A simple sentence is very dramatic. It can be used for dramatic effect, as this example will show you. Amber hurried back down the twisting staircase, her breath echoing as she went. Behind her, rustling like sinister whispers, she heard her pursuers. She leapt down the last few steps and sprinted back to the shadowy room where she had entered the house. The door was gone. See how dramatic that last sentence is? Nothing like a simple sentence to add some panache. A little je ne sais quoi. To review, complex sentences occur when a dependent clause is added to a simple sentence. Just as a little review, depending on the location of the independent clause, a complex sentence could be either loose or periodic. Let's talk about the difference. Loose sentences begin with the independent clause and then continue with one or more dependent clauses. These sentences emphasize less important details and descriptions that help create the mood and or tone. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. So what mood is established here? Periodic sentences. They wait until the end to provide the most important part of the sentence. The periodic sentences are used to build tension and suspense and work to increase the reader's interest. For example, when the storm of grief had spent itself, here's your independent clause. She went away to her room alone. Oh, what's going to happen next? This woman with a heart condition's gone into her room by herself when she hears this terrible news. How does this sentence create suspense? Writer's craft practice. Okay, we're going to look at these three sentences, and we're going to go over one and create one as a loose sentence and one as a periodic. And you may want to go over 2 and 3 on your own. Number 1. Carlos choked down the disgusting bowl of soup. And here's this as a loose sentence. There were chunks of mustard-colored vegetables with green flakes of what could possibly be broccoli, but Carlos bravely choked down the disgusting bowl of soup. That certainly does create a mood, doesn't it? Now, let's create some suspense with that same sentence stem. After Carlos had swallowed as much of this soup as possible, he stood up, doubled over with cramps, to duck walk across the room. Well, that sentence is filled with suspense. What's going to happen to Carlos next? Now let's revise our story. Our first step to revise is to reread our story and see whether the desired mood or tone is clear. Look at your word choices clearly to see if the mood and tone could be clarified or emphasized better. Step 2. Highlight all the sensory details that define mood or tone. Brainstorm additional sensory details that could help define the mood or tone more clearly. Step 3. Mark the literary strategies and devices in your story. Take notes on where you can add and substitute strategies and devices to broaden the range of their usage and to enhance the plot. Step 4. Look for areas where you can use varied syntax for specific effect. Step 5. Reread your draft and use the list of elements of a good short story to evaluate your work so far. And step 6. Share your story with another person. I hope you found this video entertaining, and I just want to thank you for sharing your time with me. And remember, keep learning to write and writing to learn.